Hello, everybody, and welcome to this short presentation about mastery learning. So I'd like to share with you an approach that we've been using at our school for about 4 or 5 years. Now, to get the most out of this presentation, what I recommend you do is sit and watch this with a colleague, and then pause the presentation periodically or stop at a certain slide and have discussions. That way, you'll get the most out of it. So let's begin with a key question. Why do we assess? Now, I think we typically do it for three reasons, either to rank or rate the students, to reward or punish them, or perhaps even to help them learn. Now, the question that I have for you is, where does most of your assessment energy go? Think about this for a moment. I know if I answered this question about 15 years ago, I would say quite unequivocally, most of my energy went into ranking or rating students, then a little bit toward the reward or punishment, and very little went towards helping students learn for the simple reason that students would just look at the mark on the test or the assignment and just toss it away, never returning to it again. I'd like to describe a little bit about my old practice, which I have since modified. So we start by training our students at the beginning of our science course how to answer a question. We do a lot of descriptive writing in our science classes, so we want to teach students to write very clearly, concisely. So we take a careful look at these details. Now we do continue this in our current format, but it's the next step which is different. We would also train the students on how we evaluate their work. So we had a 0 through 5 rating scale from pretty poor to pretty darn awesome. And so we used this for many years. And as time went by, I began to realize, but as time went by, I became less and less satisfied with this. And I began to realize just how much time and energy it was consuming. Because assessment has a cost. We have to prepare the materials. We have to, in my case, train the students. And then there's that time that goes into the actual marking of it. And then what I call the haggling time. And more often than not, this was haggling time just within myself. So I'd be taking a look at that piece of work and thinking, well, is it actually a 4 out of 5? This part's good, but this part's not so much. And oh, if I give this person a 3 and that person a 4, I know they're going to compare their work and there'll be questions asked. And so I just spend a lot of time worrying about these gradations in the marking scale. And I began to realize that time and energy is really not helping my students at all. So what is the role of assessment in learning? So this is the one piece of science that I want to introduce you folks to. So let's take a look at how the brain functions on a very basic level. It's extremely complex, but let's simplify it into the brain's operations in roughly 4 different areas. So toward the back of our brain, we receive the inputs from our various senses. From there, signals travel to the sort of side and back area of our brains, where our brains assign meaning to those sensory inputs. That's where they figure out, oh, that's a car, oh, that's a person. From there, signals go to the front part of our brain, where we do our abstract reasoning. So this is where we come up with our plans, our ideas. And from there, signals go to the top part of our brain, which is our motor cortex. So we take our plans and then we do things. We physically carry out actions based on our thinking. And then that creates new stimulus, new inputs, and it is a cycle. And this cycle is always happening at many different levels of complexity at the same time. And it is the basic way that our brains learn. So we call this the cognitive learning cycle. And it's one of the most fundamental ideas that teachers should understand about those brains that appear in their classrooms. So the question is, where does assessment fit into this cognitive learning cycle? Just take a moment to think about that and what is involved in assessment. I think assessment fits in right between the do, the testing stage where you're physically carrying out an action, and the input stage. So the students might write an answer to a question or share a thought by talking to a colleague. And that produces new inputs based on what they see or the responses that they get from the teacher or from that colleague. So this is where assessment lies in the cognitive learning cycle. And we want this cycle to happen as often and as smoothly as possible. So what that means is we need very regular assessment. I'm not so fond of the distinctions of assessment for, as, or of learning, because from this fundamental point of view of how our brains operate, assessment is learning. It's fundamental to the learning process. Learning can't happen without some form of assessment. And it doesn't have to be traditional teacher-based assessment, but that's actually for another presentation. So we want to keep this cycle going as often as possible. That way students learn as much as possible. So I decided I'm going to throw out my old marking scheme, the 0 to 5 rating scale, and I'm going to simplify it. So I simply give students a 0, and I explain carefully at the beginning so that they don't panic, that the 0 just means you have improvements to make. Or I'll give them a check mark. And that check mark they understand means they get a 1 out of 1 for that task, or 100%. So if it's acceptable work, I don't worry about the gradations in between. They get the mark for it. But if there's improvements to make, they get the 0. Here's what my mark sheet for grade 9 science looked like after about 2 weeks of the course. So you can see there are a number of entries already. And you can see the check marks that I had given students. You can see some of the zeros where improvements were required. The blank slots represent work that wasn't handed in at all. You might even notice a check mark inside some of those zeros. So let's explore this process. Now, the first thing that I want to mention is what types of work I do this for. It tends to be for small, discrete pieces of learning, like their daily lessons or the homework assignments that I give. Larger tasks, such as quizzes or projects, I still have a more detailed marking scheme. So this is how my process works. I'll kind of walk you through it. So at the end of class, I'll ask students to hand in today's work. So what you see on the screen here is a typical example of the work that we do in our grade 9 science class. So there's a lot of descriptive writing about the observations that we make or the deductions that we make or infer. And so students handed in this work, and this work was pretty good. I gave it the check mark. Now, an important question that I have in my mind is, what should I focus on in order to decide whether or not the students need to improve? So I definitely don't look at the whole piece of work. Okay, I home in on what I think is 1 or 2 key questions or key skills, because I want to make sure that they've got those ideas before moving on much further in our unit. And when I give them feedback, it is extremely simple. So I'll just circle the question, or I'll circle just a piece of the work itself or the response. Very rarely I'll write a word or two because that slows me down and I have to have the cycle operating very quickly and efficiently. So this is not the time for descriptive feedback. It's the time for very simple feedback to get that cognitive learning cycle going as quickly as possible. So here's an example from that same assignment. We were drawing charge diagrams and we were rubbing a cloth on a balloon. So the student had some difficulties with drawing the charges. So I circled the diagrams themselves, and I put another circle over here just to help draw their attention to it. That's it, aside from the 0 on the front page, which reminds them, uh-oh, there's some improvements that I need to make to this work. So an important question is, what standard of work should I accept? And for strong students, I'm really looking for top quality work. Even the spelling of science words could be one single word on their page, but if it's an important one, like neutral, I want you to spell neutral properly. I circle it, and in this example, the student has already made the corrections that you see in the image. Now, with weaker students, there's often parts that are incorrectly answered or sections that might be left blank from their work. I circle it, and I send it back to them. And so for them, I'm looking and I'm trying to decide, are the basic skills there? Do they have just the core ideas, maybe not the subtlety or the careful explanations, but are the core ideas there so that they're ready to move on to the next lesson? So what that means is I'm adopting a very flexible standard that I apply when I decide, is the work acceptable? And I try to connect this with students' zone of proximal development. So this is an idea from educational psychology where we try to identify as teachers, what's that next step that students need help in moving through in their learning. So I try to identify what's most important for that particular student, which means the standard is different for each student. And this becomes what I think is a very important form of differentiation. So while there are flexible standards, there are definitely minimum requirements because there's certain things that you need to be able to do before you can move on in the lessons of the unit. So I want to flag those things and give the students an opportunity to improve their skills or understandings. So once I see that the work has been improved, I'll give them a check mark. You can see that at the top of the page here. And then I go back to my marking page and I put a check mark in the 0. And the sections that are just totally blank, that's also a good visual reminder for me that the student just hasn't handed in anything at all. Now, sometimes the students will return some work which is still incorrect, or it still needs to be improved in other ways. And so I'll just circle it again, but sometimes I might add an extra word or two. And I got the sense in this example that the student would likely struggle without some direct help. So I added, ask me about this. Okay, but I sent it back to the student. It's still not meeting my acceptable standard. They still have to make improvements before they're ready to move on. Sometimes the tasks, the assignments that I give students are a little more complex. And the question is, should I go through it all to give feedback? And the answer is no, I try to avoid this because it's extremely time consuming and it puts the effort in the wrong place. So instead, what I usually do is I have students compare their work with model solutions that I've produced. And they have to decide what should be corrected or improved, or what looks fine. And we use a different colored pen, so we call it blue penning our work. We use a different colored pen to mark the corrections and improvements onto the student's work. And then they submit it for the first time. So here's an example of this, which comes from my grade 11 physics class. And I'm hoping you're able to notice the difference between the blue pen and then the original work the student did in pencil. So you can see the student has added quite a few minor corrections to their work. So this allows me to quickly glance at the page and I can see, all right, looks like the student did a pretty responsible job of correcting their work. Now I'm not at all reading through all of this. Now I know that students tend to have difficulty with the motion diagrams, for example. So here I will turn my attention. I'll look at it carefully and I'll see that they have the original work correct or sometimes even the improvements they do incorrectly. So I take a look at that and I give them the check mark or I give them the 0. So this is a good way to make the feedback or the marking of more complex work more efficient for us as teachers. Now, what's really important about this shift is that it adjusts where the effort goes into making these improvements. Because we've all known as teachers that the person who puts in the effort is the person who does the learning. And if we as teachers are providing all of that descriptive feedback or are putting in all those corrections, we might be learning something, especially about the difficulties our students have. But chances are the students will learn very little or nothing from that effort. And so that is not a wise use of our time and energy. So the students need to put in that effort correcting their work and making the improvements because we want them to learn and improve from that process. Here's a piece of feedback that students have provided. At the end of our first test in grade 11 physics, I just asked them the simple question, what aspect of learning in our grade 11 physics course helped you the most? And so in this example, the student explains that it's the homework and those corrections, that correction process, that she found very helpful because that highlighted in her mind, it brought her attention to the things that she didn't get right the first time, the things that were challenging. And so it helps that to stick, that, oh yeah, these are the improvements that I need to make. Going back to our grade 9 science course, because of the pandemic, we adjusted our assessment from our traditional model. For example, we eliminated the final exam, and we also eliminated the regular tests. So right now, we have our in-class activities, that's our daily work, and then we have our assignments, that's our homework. And together, these are weighted at 20% each or 40% of the overall course. And these are the parts of the course that I mark using this mastery learning approach of just a 0 or a 1. And an important question is, well, what are we going to do in the future when school returns to something that's closer to normal? And I have a hunch we're going to keep these changes. So I think we're quite happy with moving our emphasis away from the traditional tests and putting a strong emphasis on our daily work and our homework. So now let's talk about the main theme here. What is mastery learning? So it's deciding whether or not the student's work or their understanding, their skills, meets a certain standard. And usually this represents a fairly high standard. It could correspond to maybe an 80 or an 85% in a traditional marking scheme. And we simply ask the question, yes or no, does it meet that standard? Because we take this simplified approach to the student's evaluation, we're sure to provide them with multiple opportunities to meet these standards. So they have these opportunities to improve their work. And then we give them full credit for it. We don't average things out. We just keep things as simple as possible. Right? If you can demonstrate the skills, you get full credit for this piece of work. And that's an important part of what makes this process work, what makes it manageable for us as a teacher. What I really like about this is that it emphasizes improvement in the learning process, which really didn't exist in the way that I used to teach. It also, very importantly, normalizes the role of mistakes in learning because we're all going to make mistakes. We can't be perfect all the time. Many of us are not even close to perfect. But it's really important that we learn to take those mistakes and improve our understanding based on them. So as opposed to mistakes being penalties, which tends to encourage our students to be very risk averse in their learning, it tends to increase their anxiety because they are afraid of missing these opportunities for marks or losing marks. This helps to normalize the role of mistakes. You've got another crack at it. Just make the improvements. So why does it work? I find that my student work has been overall improving quite a bit since we started this mastery learning process. I think the main reason is that it emphasizes that what we do each day in class or at home is what matters the most. I see this a lot, especially at the start of grade 9, when students first arrive and they have been habituated by their previous learning experiences that what they do in class really doesn't matter. They can sit around like lumps, and in their mind, they're telling themselves, oh, well, I'll just get the work from a friend the night before a quiz, and then I'll learn it and it'll be fine. And these are learning habits and behaviors that we do not want to encourage. Okay, but I see them quite clearly, especially in my new students. So this approach to mastery learning helps to counteract that. What you do every day in class is what is most important for your learning. So it requires students to invest the effort to learn. So it is not as simple as, okay, you just kind of memorize the stuff the night before the test. It's that steady building of your skills and your understanding each day in class, which is what is important. It also helps me to very quickly form a picture of my students' progress. So by the end of the second week of grade 9 science, I've already collected a good handful of pieces of work from students. So I've got a pretty reliable idea who has good learning habits and behaviors and who I need to watch carefully and provide more structure for or more help with. Now, a very important question is how do I manage this? Because it does involve a lot of work. So the student work that I give to students and they produce for me is highly organized. And so you saw that in the images and the scans of the work that I showed earlier in this presentation. So the work is very carefully organized on the pieces of paper so that if I'm looking for this particular skill or this piece of understanding, I know exactly where to look on that piece of paper in order to find it. If students were writing free form on a piece of paper, it would take them more than twice as long. So a high level of organization helps me to do this efficiently. I only carefully check a small part of their work. It's really easy to see at a glance if large parts are blank or if they're just carelessly done. But it's really only a small part that I check carefully on work that is relatively complete. And I choose how often to collect the work, and it's simply based on my own workload. If I have a test from another class, so I know I have a good pile of marking waiting for me, then in my grade 9 science class, I won't ask them to hand in anything that day. So it ebbs and flows, and I adjust it to the rest of my workload. Now, especially with my grade 11 physics class, when I start the students working in their groups, they're often able to work for 5 or 10 minutes without needing any assistance from me. They're just getting into things, getting things going, and so they haven't really hit the stumbling blocks in their learning yet. And during those 5 or 10 minutes, I can blitz through a whole class's worth of work. If I ask them, for example, to hand in their homework at the start of class. And all I'm doing is I'm circling key questions. If I see improvements, quickly record it, send it back. So I can do that in under 10 minutes. Again, because the work is highly structured and carefully organized. So this is the key lesson that I have for us as teachers. It's our assessment practices that drive student behaviors. They behave the way they do in our classes largely because of the way that we choose to assess them. And so it's really important that we choose practices that support the most helpful, the most productive learning behaviors, and that we really stop the practices that encourage the worst behaviors. So this is the approach that we've been using at my school for mastery learning. We found it has been really helpful, especially for the basic, the core skills that students are developing in our courses. So I hope you found this interesting, and you can see there are a variety of links here. You can download this presentation, or you can check out the science resources that I use for my students. So thank you very much, everybody. Feel free to reach out to me anytime if you have any questions. Bye-bye.